Who's shooting? Somebody yelled. Nobody answered. Because the answer was already visible. A woman. 5'3". Medical bag still on her back. Both hands on a rifle, that wasn't hers, settled into the pine needles like she'd been born there. Not shaking. Not hesitating. Just breathing. 780 meters uphill. Complete darkness. Wind gusting 18 miles per hour. A SEAL team leader bleeding out 3 feet behind her. One lung. No time. She had 40 seconds. Maybe. She found the stillness her father had taught her at 9 years old, before anyone decided who she was supposed to be. Before they buried his name in a classified file. Before they folded a flag over an empty box and handed it to her mother and called it done. One breath out. One shot. Silence from the ridge. Petty Officer Cale Doherty, combat veteran, 3 deployments, said very quietly, "Who the hell just did that?" She was already back on her patient. She never answered. She didn't need to.
The mountains didn't care who you were. That was the first thing Ray Voss ever told his daughter about the wilderness. Not about beauty, not about peace, not about the way the light hit the upper rock face at dawn and made you feel briefly like the world had been arranged for your specific benefit. About indifference. The mountains don't know your name, Elara. They don't care about your rank, your record, or your reasons. They just exist. And if you're not paying attention, they'll kill you as casually as a change in weather. She was 9 years old when he said that. Standing in the backyard in Kerrville, Texas, in the early morning before the heat settled in like a second atmosphere. The grass still wet, the air still cool, her father behind her, not touching except for his hands over hers on the rifle stock, adjusting her grip by fractions of an inch, patient in the way that certain people are patient. Not because patience comes easy, but because they have decided this particular thing deserves it. She was 27 now, standing at the edge of a ridgeline in the Nevada dark, listening to the wind come off the Ashford Peaks like something alive, something testing her. She was paying attention. She had never stopped. Her kit weighed 31 pounds, not the rifle, not the tactical gear she wore over her uniform, the plate carrier and the pouches, and the equipment that everyone else, on this team, took for granted as the natural costume of their profession. Just the medical bag on her back. Cat tourniquets, 4 of them, because 2 was the standard and she didn't believe in standards when lives were the unit of measurement. Hemostatic gauze. Nasopharyngeal airways in 2 sizes, because airways came in 2 sizes, and she had learned that the hard way once, at Fort Bragg, in a simulation that was supposed to be hypothetical, and stopped feeling hypothetical around the 3rd minute. A decompression needle in a rigid case with a snap closure. She could operate in complete darkness with one hand. She had timed this multiple times, starting when she was 22 and continuing until the number stopped improving. A set of pressure dressings, a surgical airway kit in its own sealed pouch, 2 units of freeze-dried plasma in insulated sleeves, chest seals vented, a pair of trauma shears she kept sharp enough to cut through denim in a single stroke, because seconds were not abstract in her line of work. She had packed it herself, 3 times before departure, in a specific order that never varied. Every pouch touched and confirmed in sequence, eyes closed by feel, because the moment when she would need something from this bag would not be a moment with good lighting and adequate time. It would be a moment like this one, dark, cold, moving. Chief Petty Officer Dax Merritt had watched her repack it on the helicopter without comment. He was the kind of man who watched first and spoke second, which was a rarer combination than people realized and a more useful one than most. He had a quality of stillness about him, not passivity. Nothing like passivity, more like a very large engine idling at very low RPM. All that potential energy sitting quiet and ready and not particularly concerned with being visible. She had worked with him 3 times before this operation. She trusted him the way she trusted equipment she'd personally inspected. Not blindly, based on evidence. Petty Officer Second Class Cale Doherty had said something about the repacking. He usually said something. You pack that thing like it owes you money. She hadn't looked up. Her hands were on the second tourniquet, checking the windlass. It does. Every time I use it, someone gets to keep living. That's a debt. Doherty had blinked at that, then looked out the window, which was, honestly, the correct response. The briefing had been clean, Professionally clean. The kind of clean that meant someone had spent a significant amount of time making something complicated look simple, which was either good staff work or something else, and she had learned not to assume which one she was looking at until she had more information. Lieutenant Commander Brennan Forsyth had stood in front of the map, like a man who was comfortable being believed. Silver at the temples. Late 40s. Eyes that moved slowly in a face that was otherwise still not slow because he was tired. Not slow because he was uncertain. Slow because he was deciding at every moment what to let you see. She had met people like that before. They were either very good at their jobs or very good at something else, and sometimes both. She had noticed that on first introduction. She had not done anything with the noticing yet. Primary objective, Forsyth had said, the pointer resting on the elevation contour lines of the Ashford Ridge terrain, is the apprehension of the individual operating under the alias Carver, believed to be coordinating the acquisition and movement of man-portable air defense systems, MANPATS, across the Nevada-Utah corridor. 6 confirmed personnel on site, possibly 8. He had paused there. Just briefly, the DI analyst embedded with your element will make primary identification upon visual confirmation. The DI analyst. Ren Aldridge, 31 years old, compact build, economical movement, the kind of face that was pleasant without being memorable, which was either nature or practice, and she suspected practice. He had shaken her hand on the tarmac with exactly the right pressure. Not the aggressive overgrip of a man proving something. Not the limp handshake of someone who didn't think the greeting mattered. Calibrated, the precise midpoint that said, I've thought about this. She didn't know why that bothered her. She stored it, filed it in the part of her mind she kept for things that weren't evidence yet. Captain Voss. Forsyth had looked at her directly when he said it. You'll maintain rear security and medical support. Standard role. Standard role. She had nodded, said nothing, because the thing about having a standard role was that you saw everything from the back. And the back was where patterns were visible, and she had always been better at patterns than people gave her credit for. Because people saw the medical bag and assumed a certain kind of mind, and the kind of mind they assumed was not the kind of mind she had. Her father had taught her that too. Let them underestimate you, Elara. Underestimation is a resource. Spend it wisely. The team assembled at the staging area at 1,800. She ran through their medical profiles from memory. Because she had memorized them the night before. Because that was what she did. She memorized the bodies she was responsible for, so that if something went wrong with one of them in the dark, she already knew its history. Dax Merritt, 44, no significant injuries currently active. A healed tibial fracture from 2019 that had been surgically repaired and showed no functional limitation. Mild hypertension, managed without medication. Blood pressure last recorded at 128/82. Cale Doherty, 24. No injury history of significance. Full physical clearance issued 6 weeks prior. Slight asymmetry in his left shoulder from a collegiate injury. She'd noticed it in his movement, the way he favored the left side on heavy carries. Kowalski, 38, the fragment wound scar on his left hand. She had read the surgical report. Clean extraction, no retained material. Nerve involvement minimal. He compensated slightly in cold weather when the scar tissue contracted. She noted the temperature. 41 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. Ruiz, 35. The kind of physical condition that looked effortless and wasn't. No significant injury history. Moved like he'd been born in the dark. She knew their bodies. She would know how to fix them if they broke. That was the contract. That was what standard role meant. She accepted the terms. She always accepted the terms. She just also happened to be carrying something else. 13 years of something else. Packed as carefully as her medical bag, held as close, checked just as often in the dark. Ashford Ridge at 2,200 hours was a different planet. The temperature had dropped through the afternoon and kept dropping. By the time they were 2 kilometers into the tree line, it was hovering at 38 degrees, with a wind chill that put the felt temperature around 32. The ponderosa pines were dense and old massive trunks, the bark plated and reddish-brown in daylight, now just dark shapes in darker shapes. The root systems broke the surface in places, humped ridges of wood under a carpet of needles and decomposed organic matter, the kind of terrain that punished inattention. Cale Doherty was not being sufficiently attentive. She could hear it in his step pattern. 3 steps clean, then the faint brush drag of his toe on the recovery. 3 steps, brush drag, not loud, but present. A sound that didn't belong in this environment and therefore was exactly the sound that trained ears would key on. She didn't say anything yet. She filed it. Ruiz moved without sound. Kowalski moved with a deliberate weight placement that minimized contact time. Dax moved with what she had privately catalogued as the walk of someone who had been doing this long enough that the forest had simply recalibrated around his presence. And Ren Aldridge moved with the spacing and positioning of someone who was maintaining a very specific relationship to the team's formation. Never more than 12 feet from the man ahead. Never less than 8 exact. Consistent. Not the spacing of familiarity, the spacing of calculation. She watched him for 40 minutes. She watched the way his head moved, the direction of his attention, the pattern of his hand resting near but not on his sidearm, the way he looked at the tree line, not the scanning look of someone monitoring for threat, but the directional look of someone checking a reference point. The third time she caught him, orienting southeast, she made a note. Southeast was not the direction of the objective. Southeast was the direction of the road they'd come in on. She filed it. First night camp at 100, in a natural depression in the terrain with adequate overhead cover and decent sight lines on 3 approaches. Dax set the watch rotation. She took the 300 to 430 slot. She did not sleep during her off time. She lay in the shelter, with her bag against her back and thought about Kerrville. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch style on a street, with 2 large live oaks that had grown into each other overhead and created something like a canopy over the front walk. Her mother had moved into that house in 1996, 1 year before Elara was born, and had not left it since. Not for lack of options, Mag Voss had had options. She was the kind of woman who generated options through sheer capability. Her administrative work at the VA hospital had advanced her 3 times in 10 years. She'd been offered a district position in Austin, twice. She had family in Phoenix who'd asked her to come. She had stayed. She had stayed because Ray Voss had helped her plant the 2 live oaks as saplings, and she intended to see them full grown, and that was the reason she gave. And Elara had believed it until she was old enough to understand that the real reason was simpler and harder and had nothing to do with trees. You stayed where you'd been happy, even when what made you happy was gone. Even if gone turned out not to mean gone the way you thought it meant. She stopped that thought. She didn't go down that road. She rolled onto her side, put her hand on the medical bag, ran the inventory again from the beginning. Tourniquet, gauze, needle, plasma, chest seal. Each item confirmed by touch in sequence. The ritual of it. The way her father used to check his equipment before any operation, not because he doubted himself, but because the act of checking was itself a preparation. Each confirmed item was a decision pre-made. Make your decisions before the moment comes, he had said. The moment is too loud to think in. She was 9 years old. She had nodded seriously. He had laughed not unkindly and said, "You look like a colonel when you do that." And she had said, "I know." And he had laughed again, louder, and she had felt like she'd won something without entirely understanding the game. She closed her eyes, didn't sleep, continued the inventory. She took her watch position at the north edge of the depression, back against a pine trunk, the NVG monocular she'd been issued running on its lowest gain setting to preserve battery. The world in front of her was green and gray and dimensionless, in the way of night vision imagery, all detail flattened, all depth compressed, but movement was visible, and movement was what she was watching for. The ridge above them was quiet. Too quiet, she might have said, if she'd permitted herself clichés, which she didn't. What she said to herself instead was, "The ambient insect signature is below what I'd expect at this elevation in September. And that tells me something has disturbed the local ecology within the last 6 to 12 hours. That was more words. But it was accurate. She thought about the count. 6 confirmed, possibly 8. She thought about the way Ren had oriented southeast, 3 times, at intervals that suggested checking, not scanning. She thought about what would produce a disrupted insect signature at 300 on an otherwise still night, and she clicked twice on the comm because that was Dax's frequency. And it was the signal they had agreed on, for "I hear you," adjusting, and she used it now as "Are you awake?" 2 clicks back within 4 seconds. "Good." She spoke low, barely above breath, insect signatures off below baseline for the elevation and season. Pause, then Dax's voice, equally low, the voice of a man who had also not been sleeping. "How long? Can't say. But it's not us. We've only been in the depression 4 hours. This reads older. Numbers. More than 8, she said. My guess. A silence that lasted 10 seconds, then 2 clicks. I hear you adjusting. She went back to watching. The second day was for waiting and information. At 900 Ren put his drone up. She watched the drone go from the corner of her position, noting the time, noting the direction, noting the altitude at which he leveled it off lower than she'd expected for the stated purpose of perimeter survey, higher than you'd run if you were trying to avoid detection from above. The footage came back at 1,130. Ren spread it on the tablet and the team gathered. She stood at the back, which was her position, which gave her the angle of watching both the screen and the faces watching the screen. 14 signatures. Not 6, not 8. 14 warm bodies in the target area. Kowalski's jaw shifted sideways in the specific way of a man recalibrating without wanting to show the recalibration. Kale said, "That's more than doubled." Kowalski said, "Outstanding observation," without looking at him. Kale opened his mouth. Thought better of it. Progress. Dax looked at the overlay without visible reaction, then looked at Ren. When did the count change? Hard to say, Ren said. Could have been reinforcement over the last 24 hours. Could have been an undercount on the initial intelligence. Could have been. 2 words that were doing a lot of work. Elara was looking at the movement pattern of the 14 signatures. 2 of them nearly stationary for extended periods, rotating on a fixed schedule. The other 12 in a pattern that was consistent with perimeter maintenance. Not weapons handling or transfer. Weapons operations looked different. Weapons operations involved concentrated movement towards central storage, dispersal patterns, vehicle proximity. This looked like protection, of something stationary, of something being kept. She did not say this. She looked at Ren. He was looking at the tablet. His face was doing nothing. Not processing, not concerned. Not surprised by a count that had more than doubled from initial intelligence. Nothing. She thought people who are unsurprised by new information either have extensive experience with intelligence variants or they already knew. She thought, which one are you, Ren? She thought, I'm going to find out. Forsyth came through on the SATCOM at 1,600. Go. Same timeline, same objective. Adjust for increased personnel but maintain primary parameters. She could hear the deliberateness of his voice even through the satellite compression. The specific deliberateness of a man choosing each word after weighing it. She had been doing that calculation on him since the briefing. The thin file on her marksmanship. The too long look at the LZ the previous night. The way he'd looked at her, not the way a commander looks at an asset, but the way someone looks at something they've been waiting to see. She was building a picture. She didn't have enough pieces yet, but the picture was coming. At 1,700, she walked the route to the target area on paper, spread her map flat on the ground, oriented it to north, and walked her eyes along the terrain features between their position and the objective. The eastern approach was viable. It added 40 minutes, but offered better overhead cover and a more gradual elevation gain. Except the eastern approach had 2 natural choke points, narrow passages between terrain features where movement was forced into a single file. A single file with no lateral dispersion, in an environment where 14 people had positioned themselves in ways consistent with protection of a fixed asset. She stared at the eastern approach for a long time. Then she looked at Ren across the camp. He was not looking at her, he was looking at his tablet, but his right hand was at rest on the satellite phone on his thigh. Just resting, just there. She went back to her map. At 1,830 Ren, stepped outside the staging shelter to check the drone charging station, which was a reasonable thing to do, and a legitimate reason to be alone for 3 to 4 minutes. She moved to his workstation. His tablet was locked, standard. She didn't touch it. His satellite phone was not locked, not standard. She picked it up, navigated to sent messages. Last sent 340, the previous night, a string of numbers. She recognized the format grid coordinates, 8-digit military grid reference. She read them twice, committed them, put the phone down exactly where she'd found it, and moved back to her corner before Ren returned. She sat down. She opened her medical bag, began checking inventory. Tourniquet, grid coordinates committed to memory, the LZ, gauze. Sent at 345 minutes after they'd carried Dax to the landing zone. Needle. He had sent their extraction location to an unsaved number, plasma, while Dax was on the ground. Chest seal. While she had her hands on Dax's chest, She checked each item precisely. The routine of it holding her still while her mind moved very fast in a direction she hadn't asked it to go and could not stop. The analyst who gave us a count of 6 when the count was 14. Who sent our LZ coordinates at 340. Who is now proposing an approach route with 2 choke points and no clean extraction. And whose face does nothing. When it should do something, she closed the bag. She looked at Kowalski, who was making coffee and concentrating on it with the intensity he applied to all physical tasks. She looked at Kale, who had come back from perimeter rotation and was doing something to his bootlace. She looked at Ren, who had returned and was sitting at his workstation and not looking at her. She decided 2 things. She decided she was not going to say anything yet, because she needed one more piece, because an accusation without sufficient evidence was a liability in a contained environment, and a liability in a contained environment could get someone killed. And she decided she was going to be awake tonight, more awake than she'd ever been. The movement began at 2100. Eastern approach as briefed. She walked third from the back, Ren in front of her, Kale ahead of Ren. The order she had requested without making it obvious she was requesting it, letting it fall out of a conversation about formation spacing with Dax that ended with her in the position she needed to be in. Dax at point. Which was where he always was, which was where his read of terrain and threat was most useful, and where his specific kind of authority, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, could guide the element without committee. She walked, and she counted. She counted Ren's steps, his head movements, the intervals at which he checked the satellite phone he was carrying in his left hand, which was not standard operational practice, which was the kind of thing you did when you were waiting for a signal. The wind was still southwest. Steady at 12, gusting to 16 now. Temperature had dropped to 36. She was wearing the right layers, but the cold was arriving at the edges of things' fingertips, the exposed skin above her collar, the bridge of her nose. She catalogued the cold as information. Temperature affects ballistic coefficient. Colder air is denser. Denser air increases drag, which means at this temperature, at this altitude, with this wind, she stopped that thought. She wasn't going to need that information. She was a medic. She was at the back. Standard role. The first choke point was a 30-meter passage between a rock face and a dense stand of old-growth pine. Single file, no lateral option. She moved through it, watching every shadow and counting the seconds because the seconds mattered, and she knew exactly how many it took for a person to clear a narrow passage and be in a defensible position again. 12 seconds per person. 6 people. 72 seconds of sequential vulnerability. She was last through. She was exactly 12 seconds from the exit when the second choke point came into view 100 meters ahead, and then everything went wrong at once, not loudly. Not the way things went wrong in films with warning sounds and dramatic music. Quietly. A single crack from the left. From outside the choke they'd just cleared. Distance she ran the sound signature 750 meters. Elevated position, slight upward angle of incidence which compressed the sound wave slightly. Ruiz went down, left leg. He said something in a short controlled burst that was not a scream. That was Ruiz confirming he was conscious and functional and angry, which was all the medical triage she needed in the first 2 seconds. Kowalski pivoted toward the source and opened fire. Kale was moving left, looking for cover that wasn't there, because they were still between the choke points and the terrain had not improved. She was moving to Ruiz. She had the bag off before she reached him. She was at his leg in 3 seconds and already assessing the entry wound, the blood pattern, the absence of the arterial pumping that would have meant a different math through and through. No major vessel. She was going to pack this and get him mobile, and it was going to hurt, and he was going to keep cursing in that controlled, focused way, and that was fine. Stay with me, she said. I'm with you, he said. Tight, precise, fix it fast, working on it. Gauze in pressure. She didn't need light. She had hands that had done this enough times that the sequence lived in them rather than in her head. And then from above, from the direction of the ridge north of them, elevated the crack of a second shot. Not at Ruiz, not at her, at Dax. She heard it. And she heard him go down. And she heard the difference in the sound of someone falling when they're hit versus when they drop for cover. And this was the first sound. Merit down. Kale's voice. Upper register. Not from fear, from the specific urgency of a man watching his element leader go horizontal and understanding what that meant. She got Ruiz's wound packed, got his hand on it. Hold that hard as you can. Copy. She moved. Dax was 9 meters away. He'd gone down in the partial cover of a boulder, whether by intent or by luck she didn't know, and it didn't matter. She covered the distance in the low crawl she'd been taught and drilled until it was faster than running for the first 3 meters. She reached him, right side of his chest. The entry wound she found by feel, by the change in his body's response under her fingers, the place where his ribcage moved differently, where the pressure of her hand produced a sound it shouldn't produce. Hemopneumothorax. Blood in the chest cavity, lung collapsing, decompression needle. She had it out of the case in 3 seconds, found the landmark second intercostal space mid-clavicular line and placed it. The hiss of releasing pressure. His next breath was still wrong, but it was better. "Stay with me," she said. Same words, same voice. "Calm the way still water is calm." "I'm here," he said. "Scraped and thin but present. I've got you." Behind her, Kowalski was firing in short bursts, controlled, professional. But she could hear in the intervals between bursts that he was not finding his target. The angle was wrong. She could map it from the sound. Kowalski was positioned too low. The ridge had an overhang that cut off his firing line above a certain elevation. "We need a shooter." Kale, from cover, from behind a pine trunk, his voice carrying the specific quality of a man who has assessed the situation and found the arithmetic unfavorable. "The high position ridge at 11 o'clock, estimate 750. Kowalski can't get the angle. I can't get the angle." She was applying the chest seal. 3-sided. 4th side open for pressure release. She looked up. The M4A6 was on the ground, 6 feet to her left. Dax had dropped it when he fell. It was lying in the pine needles with the scope up, and the bolt cycled because Dax had been at the trigger when the round hit him. She looked at the rifle, then at the ridge. "Don't." Then at Dax's chest. Rising and falling, still wrong. Improving. "You're a medic." Then at Kale, pressed behind the pine trunk, unable to move, the incoming fire keeping him pinned with mathematical precision, which told her that whoever was on that ridge was not an amateur, which meant that the next shot would not be into the ground. "You're a medic, and you're at the back, and that's your role." Then at the rifle. And the thing happened that she had prevented from happening for 8 years of deliberate, sustained, determined prevention. Her mind ran the calculation, without permission, without ceremony. Just there, complete, instant. 750 meters, Kale had called. She disagreed. The sound signature, the angle of incoming, the time delay closer to 800. Wind southwest at 12 to 16 gusting. She needed to be between gusts. Temperature 36 Fahrenheit at this elevation, which meant adjusted ballistic coefficient, slightly higher drag, which meant she needed to hold slightly less than she'd hold in standard conditions. Elevation she'd been climbing for 40 minutes at a consistent grade. She was approximately 280 meters above the valley floor. The target was higher, another 60-70 meters. Negative shooting angle, looking up, maybe 12 to 15 degrees, which compressed the effective range, which meant she adjusted down slightly. She had been doing this since she was 12 years old. She had been not doing this for 8 years. The rifle doesn't lie, Elara. Only people do. She reached out, put her hand on the M4A6. The metal was cold from the night air. The stock was set for Dax's length of pull, which was wrong for her by approximately an inch. She adjusted the cheek piece by feel in the dark 4 seconds. Because her father had made her do this drill, beginning at age 12, you will not always be shooting your own rifle. Adapt, and she had adapted until the adaptation was automatic. She settled into the pine needles. Dax found position. Prone, left elbow forward, right elbow angled, cheek on the stock. The scope was Dax's 0. She checked the elevation and windage settings by feel. Didn't change them because Dax was a professional, and his 0 was probably close enough, and she was not going to adjust optics she couldn't verify in the dark. She was going to do this with holdover, with the compensations running in her head, the way her father had run them in his, the way he'd taught her to run them, the way that hadn't gone away no matter how carefully she'd tried to pack it into a box and leave it on a shelf. She found the target, not through any single clear visual indicator, through accumulation, the slight signature of heat distortion, the movement pattern not random, periodic, the movement of a person who was repositioning between shots, the direction of the muzzle flash she'd clocked 2 positions ago. The body had a moment, between heartbeats, at the bottom of a slow exhale when everything in the physical system achieved a brief, perfect stillness. Not calm, not peace, Just, mechanic, the moment when the body stops moving in any direction and is simply present in space. Her father had called it the window. Find the window, Elara. Everything else is just waiting. She found the window. She pressed the trigger, the way he had taught her. Not pulled, not squeezed, not jerked, pressed, like you're asking a question, not demanding an answer. One shot. Silence from the ridge. Kowalski stopped firing, then the incoming stopped because there was nothing to be incoming from anymore. The sudden quiet was enormous in the way that only silence after sustained noise can be enormous, a physical presence, a dimension of its own. She was already back on Dax, both hands, checking the seal, monitoring his breath rate. His color was bad in the green-gray of her NVG, but his eyes were tracking her, oriented, present. Medic is here, she said. He made a sound that was approximately I know. Behind her, absolute silence for 5 full seconds. Then Cale Doherty said, very quietly, to no one in particular, who the hell just did that? She didn't answer. She had both hands on Dax's chest and the night had 11 more hours in it, and there was work to do. The extraction was 2 hours of sustained controlled urgency. She moved between Dax and Ruiz across alternating intervals, monitoring both, adjusting Ruiz's packing when his hand pressure dropped, and it twice did, getting the plasma going on Dax, because his pressure was trending in a direction she didn't like. Cale and Kowalski moved them, following her directions without argument, which was, she noted, the first time the team had operated as a single unified entity since the insertion. Threat had a way of simplifying the command structure. The LZ was 2 kilometers back the way they'd come. It took 47 minutes. She counted everyone. Dax was conscious when they reached the flat ground at the landing zone, which was not guaranteed and was not nothing. He was on his back on a litter that Cale and Kowalski had improvised from their packs and a section of cordage, and his breathing was still wrong in the way it was going to keep being wrong until she got him into a proper surgical bay. But it was sustainable wrong. He reached up, put his hand on her forearm, not grabbing, not urgent, just placing. The way you'd confirm something real. She let him. That shot, he said. His voice was compressed, working around the reduced lung volume, but each word was clear. 800 meters. 780, she said. Approximately. In the dark. The dark doesn't change the physics. He was eyes on her face with an expression she was filing away for later, when she had time to interpret it. No, he said. It doesn't, does it? She checked his seal, adjusted the tape on the upper corner, didn't respond. Who taught you, he said. She looked at him. My father, good teacher, the best I've seen. He closed his eyes, opened them again, still tracking, good sign. What was his name? She paused. Just one beat. Ray Voss, she said. Sergeant First Class, 75th Ranger Regiment. Something moved in Dax's face, very small. Very fast. She catalogued it without naming it yet. Desert Storm, he said. Yes, and Somalia. I've heard that name. Most people in this line of work have. He passed. She looked at him steadily. That's the official record. The silence between them was not empty. Dax held her gaze for 4 seconds. He was a man who understood when a silence was carrying weight and had the discipline not to rush it. Then Elara. First name. She noted that. Yeah, we're going to have a conversation. When I'm not lying on a field litter with a hole in my chest. I know, a real one. I know, Dax. He closed his eyes again, his breathing steadied slightly. She watched his chest for 30 seconds before she allowed herself to look away. Forsyth arrived at the LZ by vehicle before the helicopter, which meant he'd been closer than the forward operating base would account for, which meant he'd been moving toward their position before the call went out, which meant he'd been expecting the call. She filed that. She stood when he approached, not deference, readiness. He looked at Dax on the litter, at Ruiz seated, his leg packed and elevated on a gear bag, at Kowalski standing, his right hand flexing and releasing in the cold. Then at her. He held that look 3 beats too long, not surprised. She had been watching for surprise, some flicker of it, however controlled. At a report that included medic took an 800-meter shot in blackout conditions under fire. There was nothing. The absence of surprise was itself a data point. Captain Voss, his voice was level. Walk with me. 15 meters into the dark, behind the tree line. Not subtle, but functional. The shot, he said. Yes, sir, walk me through the ballistic calculation. Not how did you make the shot. Not where did you learn to do that. The specific, technical, walk me through the calculation. The question of a man who already knew the answer was valid and wanted to see if hers matched. She told him. Wind speed and direction, temperature adjustment, angle correction for elevation delta, holdover for scope 0 variance. The window, the press. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for 6 seconds. Your marksmanship records from Fort Bragg, he said. They're thin, I know. Unusually thin. I noticed that approximately 3 years after graduation, I submitted a records request. The response said the data had been archived during a system migration and was unavailable for retrieval. Pause. Sir, she kept her voice even, factual. The voice she used when she needed information from someone who wasn't volunteering it, who removed my marksmanship records, the generator of a vehicle idling somewhere in the dark, the wind in the upper pines. I did, he said. 3 words. Delivered like coordinates. She let the statement sit in the air between them for a moment. Let it be the size it actually was. Then why? He looked at her, the slow eyes doing their deciding. To keep you in a medical designation. Away from combat units, away from certain conversations. Certain conversations about what? He didn't answer. She said, about my father. He said nothing. Which was an answer. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had built her role for her. Who had taken her best skill and made it invisible, and handed her a medical bag and sent her to the back. Standard role. My father's record, she said. Is it thin too? The wind moved through the upper branches. Get some rest, Captain, he said. Debrief at 700. He walked back toward the vehicle. She stood in the dark and watched him go, and thought, he didn't ask which eye I use. He didn't ask what my natural trigger pressure is. He didn't ask any of the questions a man without prior knowledge would ask about a shot like that. He asked me to walk through the calculation. Because he already knew I could do it. He wanted to know how much I knew about why. Cale found her before dawn. She heard him 30 seconds out because the toe drag in his step was still there. She was going to address that. Operationally, she was going to address it before the next movement because it was a liability and she took liability seriously. Hey, he said. Pick up your feet, she said. He stopped, looked down. What? Your step recovery. You dragged the left toe. In pine needles and leaf litter it produces sound, the wrong kind of sound. He processed this, then noted. He sat on a rock near her position and looked at the pre-dawn nothing for a while, which she appreciated. Young soldiers often filled silence with speech because they were afraid of what the silence said about them. Cale Doherty was revising his relationship with silence in real time, and she found it unexpectedly moving. Then that shot. She said nothing. That wasn't your first time. She ran her thumb along the spine of the notebook. Dark brown leather, soft from years of handling, the corners rounded down to smoothness. She had carried it in her left breast pocket for 9 years. Through Fort Bragg. Through her first deployment. Through every mission where she'd been at the back with the medical bag doing standard role things while the part of her that her father had built sat quiet and patient in her hands. No, she said. How long since I was 9? She opened to the first page, the handwriting dense and deliberate in the pre-dawn dark. She didn't need light to read it. He started me at 100 yards. A-22, paper targets, he said. The goal is not to hit the center. The goal is to understand why you didn't. And we'd walk up to the target together, and he'd ask me what I thought happened, and I'd tell him, and he'd tell me what was actually true. And after a while, my version and his version started to match. And after a while longer, I stopped missing. Cale looked at the notebook without asking to see it. Good instinct. Who was he said. She thought about the backyard, the cedar smell, the gunmetal, the way the early Texas light hit the target downrange and made the bullet holes visible even from 60 feet. The way her father's hands were always warm even in cold mornings. Someone the army decided to forget, she said. Cale absorbed this. Was he good? She thought about the story he'd told her when she was 12, about a shot in Desert Storm that his unit had never officially reported, because it was 700 meters in crosswind, with a rifle that was technically outside its range envelope, and if they'd reported it, someone would have asked questions about why a ranger sniper was in a position that wasn't in any briefing. She thought about the way he'd laughed telling that story. Not proud, just fond of the memory, fond of the variables, fond of the specific problem of it. He was the best I ever saw, she said, and I've been watching for someone better ever since. Cale was quiet for a moment. Until tonight. She closed the notebook. She tucked it back into her left breast pocket, buttoned the flap. I had a good teacher, she said. Dawn came sideways across the Ashford peaks. The light hit the upper rock face before it reached the trees. And for 10 minutes the world divided into orange above and blue-gray below, and Elara Voss sat exactly at the boundary of those two things with a dead man's rifle across her knees. Not dead. Dax was not dead. She needed to stop using that phrase internally, with Dax's rifle across her knees and Dax's notebook in her pocket, and the particular quality of exhaustion. That was not tiredness, but was what happened when you made a decision that 8 years of deliberate effort had been designed to prevent. She had picked up the rifle. The world had not ended. She had put it down. The world had kept going, and now she was sitting in the space between the old version of herself and whatever came next, and the space was larger than she'd expected. Not empty, just open, the way terrain looked when you crested a ridge and found that the valley below was bigger than the map had suggested. She thought about Forsyth. She thought about the thin file, the too long look, the 3 words delivered like coordinates. I did. She thought about what it meant to build a fence around someone's skills, to take the record of what they could do and make it unavailable, to hand them a different role and say, "This is who you are." She thought about her father, about the last conversation she'd had with him. She was 13. He was leaving for a training deployment. That was what they'd been told. Training, a standard rotation, 6 weeks. She had hugged him on the porch of the Kerrville house under the 2 live oaks that were still small then, still saplings really, and he had held on for 1 second longer than usual, which she had noticed and not known what to do with. He had said, "Take care of your mother." She had said, "You take care of yourself." He had laughed. Then he had gotten in the vehicle, and he had driven away, and he had not come back. She had been a medic for 8 years, because the thing that made her a shooter was also the thing that had taken her father, and she had not wanted to be made of the same material as the thing that unmade him. She understood now that this was the wrong math. The rifle hadn't taken him. Something else had. She put her hand over her left breast pocket. The notebook and the photograph of the mountains at dawn. She didn't have a photograph. She was thinking of the mental image, the one she'd been carrying of her father's face at 13. The last clear image she had that wasn't from a printed photograph on a mantelpiece. She pressed her hand flat against her chest. Behind her, Dax Merritt was alive on a litter, because she had made a choice she wasn't supposed to make. Ahead, Forsyth was in a vehicle carrying information he wasn't supposed to have, and wasn't supposed to share, and had shared anyway through a mechanism she didn't fully understand yet. And somewhere in the structure of this mission, in the reason they were here, in the file designation she'd half-glimpsed on Wren's tablet at 1830, she was going to find out what was really here. She had paid too much not to. Paying attention, she thought. "Dad, I'm paying attention." The light kept coming, indifferent and steady, and everywhere at once. She let it. The debrief was scheduled for 700. Forsyth arrived at 650, which meant he'd been waiting. Which meant he'd wanted to be there first. Which meant this conversation had been constructed. Before she walked into it, the chair placement, the folding table with its leftward list, the 2 cups of coffee he'd made and set out, 1 on each side. Small signals, deliberate ones. The language of a man who managed situations by managing the conditions around them. She arrived at 645. She had been awake since 230. She had not slept. She sat in the chair on her side of the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and said nothing and waited. The forward staging area was a converted ranger station from the 1970s 2 rooms. A generator that ran at a frequency slightly lower than standard, maps on the wall that were 2 years outdated, and therefore wrong in 6 ways she'd identified on entry. The overhead light was fluorescent and slightly warm, and made everything look like the inside of a decision someone hadn't finished making. Forsyth was standing when she came in. He remained standing for 4 seconds after she sat. Then he sat. Everything calibrated. Everything chosen. She drank her coffee and watched him and waited. "The shot," he said. "Yes, sir. Walk me through it again." She looked at him. "I walked you through it at the LZ. Walk me through it again." So he needed to hear it twice. Which meant the first time hadn't given him what he was looking for. Which meant he was checking not the information but the consistency. Which meant he was treating this like an interview where the subject didn't know they were a subject. She walked him through it again. Wind, temperature, angle, correction. The window, the press. Word for word what she'd said the first time, because she wasn't reconstructing a story. She was reporting what had happened, and what had happened didn't change between tellings. He listened, made no notes, asked no clarifying questions. When she finished, he was quiet for 8 seconds. "Your marksmanship file from Fort Bragg," he said, "is thin." "I know." unusually thin for someone who scored at the top of every other evaluation on record. I noticed that about 3 years after graduation, I put in a records request. She kept her voice even, informational. The voice she used when she needed the other person to feel that the conversation was under control even when it wasn't. The response cited a system migration. Data archived, unavailable for retrieval, and you accepted that. I accepted the official response. She set her coffee down. I didn't accept that it was true. He looked at her. She looked back. The generator hummed. Something moved in the pine outside the window, a bird, early, optimistic. The map on the wall shifted a millimeter in the air current from the door gap. Sir. She put both hands flat on the table. Open, nothing hidden. Who removed my marksmanship records from Fort Bragg? 7 seconds, he said. She had expected it. She had run the logic chain at 3 in the morning, lying awake in the shelter, and arrived at his name at the far end of it, and held the conclusion there and sat with it until it felt like ground instead of theory. Expecting it and hearing it were different things. She breathed. Once, let the sentence be the size it actually was. Why, she said. He looked at the table, then at her. The decision-making in his face was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. Not the conclusion, the process. The grinding interior weight of a man who had been carrying a specific calculation for a specific number of years and was now performing it one more time in real time. To keep you in a medical designation, he said. Away from combat billets. Away from units that would have given you operational visibility. Away from, he paused. Certain conversations about what? He said nothing. About my father, she said. The generator hummed. She stood, not in anger, controlled. The way she stood when she needed her full height and the full clarity of her presence in a room. My father's records. Are they thin too? He looked at her for a long time. We'll continue this at 1,400, he said. Get some rest, Captain. She walked out. She did not get some rest. Dax was in the back room. Medical bay improvised from a cot, a field table, and the equipment she'd brought in, her bag and the supplemental kit from the vehicle. She'd placed the chest tube herself at the LZ, in the dark, while Kowalski held a flashlight, and Ruiz sat 12 feet away providing overwatch with one hand and applying pressure to his own leg wound with the other, because Ruiz did not believe in doing one thing when he could do two. The chest tube was holding. His oxygen saturation was 93 and climbing. His blood pressure was low but trending upward as the plasma worked. She checked everything twice when she came in, then sat in the chair beside the cot and looked at him. He was awake, which she'd expected. Dax Merritt did not appear to have a functional unconscious setting. Forsyth, he said. Yes. What did he say? She told him. Concise. 3 facts. He arrived early. He removed her records deliberately. He won't say why, but she knows. Dax was quiet for a long time, looking at the ceiling. The ceiling was wood plank, the same vintage as the building, slightly warped at the north end. He looked at it the way a man looks at something when he's not looking at it, using it as a surface to think against. Your father, he said. Ray Voss. She looked at him. You said last night you'd heard that name. I said I'd heard it. In a specific context, he shifted slightly on the cot, controlled the response to the pain of that. Almost succeeded. 2015. A briefing I wasn't cleared for that I walked into because the room assignment had changed and nobody had updated the board. 2 senior officers. A project name. A date. He paused and a list. What kind of list? Names. 8 or 9 of them. People who had been... He chose the next word with the deliberateness of a man who understood the weight of the words available to him. Managed. She held his gaze. What does managed mean? Separated from operational capacity, he said. Long term. Outside conventional judicial or discharge process, the room was very still, and my father's name was on that list, she said. I didn't know it was your father. I heard the name Voss. I knew the reputation. I didn't connect it. Not until last night. Not until you said the year. The year that had divided her life into before and after. The way certain years did not cleanly, not dramatically, just permanently. One side of a line, then the other. And nothing that lived on the after side looked quite like what had been on the before. Was there a program name? She said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not withholding, recognizing. Why are you asking like you already know? Because I half saw something on Ren's tablet at 1,830 yesterday. He minimized it fast. I caught 2 words. She looked at the window, at the morning light coming through at its low September angle. Clean slate. Dax was very still. The stillness of a man who has just heard a thing confirm another thing and calculating what the combination means. Yeah, he said. Quiet, that was the name. She stood, walked to the window, put her hand on the sill, and looked out at the pines and the granite outcrops, and the specific quality of light that belonged to this elevation, this latitude, this season, and thought, my father is somewhere. My father has been somewhere this entire time. And the name is Clean Slate. I need to see that tablet, she said. Ren won't let you. Ren doesn't need to let me. She turned. I need you to rest, and I need 3 hours, and I need you to not be in this room when I talk to him. He looked at her for a long moment. The expression she'd been cataloging since the LZ, the one she hadn't had sufficient time to interpret until now. It was the look of a man revising a conclusion. Not about the mission, about her. About the specific category of person she turned out to be, which was apparently different from the category he'd initially filed her in. Good. She had never found her filing category particularly accurate. Elara, first name, quiet, yeah, be careful what you start. She looked at him. I didn't start it, she said. I just found out it started 13 years ago. She walked out. She spent the 3 hours doing 3 things. First, she tended Ruiz. His leg wound was clean, no infection developing, the packing solid. He accepted her assessment with the minimal acknowledgement of a man who considered medical attention a logistical necessity rather than a service, which she found professionally satisfying. She gave him something for pain that he accepted with slightly more argument and slightly less success at refusing than he would have liked. Second, she watched Ren. Not obviously. She had a corner that gave her a sight line to his workstation without requiring her to orient toward him. She checked her medical bag. She read from the field manual she kept in her pack's outer pouch. She ate slowly, the ration she hadn't eaten the night before, and she watched Ren Aldridge across the span of 3 hours and built a picture from accumulation. The picture had the following elements. He positioned himself within 10 feet of the exit at all times, with a sightline to both the door and the window. Not because he was tactically vigilant, his hand was never near his weapon. His posture was never alert in the specific way of someone monitoring threat. He maintained the exit proximity the way you maintained a contingency, not expecting to use it, needing to have it. His tablet showed 3 applications cycling. Analysis software, mapping, and a third application he minimized quickly whenever anyone moved within peripheral range. She caught its color twice the specific gray-blue of a classified document interface. He used his satellite phone at 900 and at 1100, both times briefly, both times stepping to the east wall as though the additional 3 feet of distance from the team produced meaningful privacy, which it did not, but which suggested he believed it did. His coffee cup. He'd made himself coffee at 700 and had not touched it, not a sip. It sat on the corner of his workstation cooling, and then cold, and then room temperature while he worked. A man who makes himself coffee and doesn't drink it is a man operating on a different kind of stimulation. He was running on something internal. Not caffeine. Anticipation possibly. The specific quality of waiting for something you know is coming. Third thing she did during those 3 hours, she planned what she was going to do next. At 1115, Ren stepped outside to check the drone charging station. She had observed his pattern well enough to know. This would take between 2 minutes 40 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on whether the charge cycle required manual reset. She waited until she heard the exterior door close. Then she crossed to his workstation. His tablet was locked. She had not expected otherwise. She did not touch it. His satellite phone was not locked. She had gambled on this based on the behavior pattern. A man who moved quickly and needed to send and receive without friction tended to sacrifice lock screen security. She picked it up, navigated to send messages. Last sent, 340 the night of the operation. A coordinate string. 8 digits. Military grid reference system. She read them twice, committed them, cross-referenced them immediately against her own mental map. Their LZ. He had sent their landing zone coordinates at 340. 45 minutes after they'd carried Dax to the ground. She looked at the number he'd sent to, unsaved. No contact name. A number she didn't recognize in a format. She did the format of a satellite relay number, the kind used when you needed communication that didn't route through conventional carrier infrastructure. She put the phone down, exactly where it had been. Orientation matched, distance from workstation edge matched. She walked back to her corner, sat down, opened her medical bag, tourniquet. He sent our LZ to an unsaved satellite relay number while Dax was on the ground. Gauze. which means someone knew where we were landing. Needle, which means the incoming fire at the LZ was not opportunistic. Plasma, which means 14 personnel was not a miscounted intelligence figure. Chest seal, which means this mission was never what we were told it was. Surgical kit, which means Ren is not an analyst. She closed the bag. She looked at Ren's untouched coffee cup. She thought, I know what you are. She thought, I need one more thing before I can use it. Forsyth's 1400 debrief was functional and unrevealing, and she spent it watching him, the way she'd spent the morning, watching Ren building the picture from what he chose to say and what he chose not to, and the specific locations of those choices within the architecture of the conversation. He asked about the shot, again. Third time now. She gave the same answer. Third time. He asked about the team's performance during the engagement. She assessed each member accurately and without editorial. He asked about Ren. She said he maintained cover effectively, which was true, and which meant nothing, and which she delivered with the exact tone of someone reporting a fact rather than someone who had memorized the timestamps on a satellite phone that morning. He looked at her when she said it. She looked back even. At 1600 he sent updated mission parameters. New intelligence from Ren's drone analysis. The primary target had relocated to a deeper position in the ridge system. New approach eastern slope. Time on target 2100. The eastern slope. She went to her map. 2 choke points, no clean extraction. 40 additional minutes of exposure, and a new target position that, if she read the overlay correctly, was actually closer to the road access from the southeast, from the direction Ren had been orienting on the first night. She stood over her map for 11 minutes. She counted them. Then she went to Forsyth and told him she had a navigational question about the updated approach and would like to review the drone footage independently. He granted it. She sat in the back room with Dax asleep 2 feet away and reviewed the footage on the tablet Forsyth had left unlocked for her, and she found what she'd been looking for at the 7-minute mark. A gap. In the recording timestamp, 1623 to 1634. 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, a small vehicle could move 8 to 10 personnel from one staging position to another, could establish them in the new location, could clear the approach path and return, could produce the imagery that would appear at 1634, showing Carver's group in the new position, as though they had always been there. Drones did not take 11-minute breaks, not unless someone paused the recording. She sat with this for a moment. Then she woke Dax. She told him in 40 seconds, flat, factual. Timestamp gap, LZ coordinates, eastern approach, 2 choke points. He came awake fast and completely and processed it without speaking. When she finished, he said, Forsyth, I don't know. You have a position. I have a direction, she said. Not a conclusion. Not yet. He was quiet, looking at the ceiling again, using it as a thinking surface. The file name, clean slate. You said Ren had it on his tablet. Twice. Minimized both times, which means he knows what it is. Which means he was sent here knowing what it is. She met his eyes. He's not here to identify Carver. Carver may not even be the objective. What is the objective? She thought about the 14 signatures, the 2 stationary ones. The pattern consistent with protection of a fixed asset. Something in the warehouse, she said. Something that's been there long enough to require a 14-person security detail and a DI asset to make sure the right people don't find it. Or make sure the right people do, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Forsyth built this mission, Elara. He built the approach. He built the team. He put you on it. A pause. Why you? She had been not asking herself this since the staging area. She had been filing it in the category of things that required more information. She was running out of patience with that category. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm going to find out tonight. What do you need from me? To be somewhere else when I talk to Ren. She picked up her bag, and to trust me. I already trust you, he said. I trusted you at 780 meters in the dark. This is not a harder ask. She almost said thank you. Didn't. Because gratitude, in a conversation like this, made both people smaller, and she needed them both large for what was coming. Rest, she said instead, and left. The second movement began at 2100. She walked third from rear, Ren ahead of her, the order she had shaped without appearing to shape it. She walked and she counted. Not steps this time. Decisions. At what point would Ren make contact with the second position? After the first choke point, when the team was committed to the approach and extraction, was no longer the path of least resistance. Before the target structure, when the team was maximally exposed and minimally positioned between the two choke points. She was certain of this. She counted her own breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The rhythm her father had taught her for high-stress environments where the body wanted to run its own panicked program and the mind needed to override it. Not suppress the response, override it, feel it fully and move through it anyway. Fear is not your enemy, Elara. Unmanaged fear is your enemy. Let it run in the background. Don't let it drive. She let it run, she drove. The first choke point was a 30-meter passage. Single file, she counted seconds through it. 12 per person, 6 people, 72 seconds of sequential narrow passage exposure. She cleared the exit and was assessing her sight lines on the second choke point ahead when she heard the shot. From the left, outside the corridor they'd just cleared, distance, 700 to 750 meters based on the sound signature, elevated, Ruiz. She heard him go down with the specific sound of a man who has been hit and knows it, and is managing that knowledge with the focused economy of someone who has been trained to absorb damage and continue. Not a scream. A controlled burst of language that confirmed consciousness, orientation, and anger. All three were good signs. She was already moving to him when the second shot came. Not from the same direction. From the ridge north higher angle, the crack arriving a half-second after the impact she heard in Dax's position. Dax, and the world split cleanly in two. Ruiz, through and through, left leg. She'd assessed the blood pattern from 6 feet. No arterial involvement. She could pack this in 40 seconds and get him mobile. She went to him first because he was closest, and because Dax's voice was still in her comm saying, "I'm down, right chest, get Ruiz first," in a voice that was compressed and wrong and absolutely certain about the priority order. She went to Ruiz, packing in, pressure. She put his hands on it. "Hold this both, hard, I've got it, tight, focused, good." She moved to Dax 9 meters in the low crawl, under the fire that was still coming from the left position, while Kowalski's return fire was finding purchase without finding the shooter, the angle all wrong, the ridge overhang cutting off his elevation. She reached Dax behind the boulder, found the wound, found it by feel by the change in his body's response under her hands in the dark, the place where his chest moved wrong. Hemop pneumothorax, same as last night, different side, of course. Needle in, the hiss, his next breath different. "Stay with me," she said. "Nowhere else to be," he said. And then shoot a ridge. 11 o'clock, nobody has the angle, she knew. She was already looking at the M40A6. Because she had been looking at the M40A6 since the moment she'd heard the second shot. The way you look at a tool when the problem the tool solves has just presented itself with perfect clarity. She thought, not again. She thought, yes. Again. Because the math is the same. She had both hands on his chest, the seal going on. 3 sides, the fourth open, she counted, his breathing rate improving. He had 3 minutes, maybe 4, before she needed both hands on him again. She picked up the rifle. This time there was no hesitation. Not because she felt nothing. Because the feeling and the action occupied different channels, and the action didn't require the feeling's permission. She settled, found position, adjusted the cheek piece in the dark 4 seconds, same drill, same muscle memory, and ran the calculation: wind, temperature, angle. The ridge was lower than the previous night, the approach angle different. The distance shorter, she read it at 6:20, 6:30, which meant the adjustment was smaller, but the wind had picked up, and the gusts were less regular now, 13 to 20 miles per hour with gaps. She needed a gap. She found it. She found the window between heartbeats, at the bottom of the exhale, the brief, perfect stillness where everything physical paused, and only the calculation remained. She pressed 1 shot. Silence. Absolute silence from the ridge and from the left position simultaneously, which told her the second shooter had lost their support anchor and was reassessing, which gave Kowalski and Kale the 2-second window they needed, and they took it with efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly that window. She was back on Dax, both checking the seal, his eyes tracking. From somewhere in the dark behind her, Kale Doherty said, even quieter than the first time, "She did it again." She had both hands on Dax's chest and did not respond. But that was not what the rewrite is about. The rewrite is about what came after. They secured Ruiz. She moved between the two of them at intervals, as the element held position, and Kowalski suppressed the remaining shooter, and Kale ran a 2-man flanking movement that produced results in 11 minutes, which was faster than she'd have given him credit for 2 days ago, and slightly faster than she gave him credit for now. Ruiz was functional. angry. Dax was compromised but present, spectacularly, characteristically, infuriatingly present. She had the medical situation managed to the degree it could be managed in the field. When she turned and found Ren Aldridge standing at the edge of the cleared area with his sidearm in his hand, she saw it before anyone else, because she had been watching him all night, because she had been watching him since 1830 yesterday, and had been building to this moment through every data point, and every filed observation, and every carefully managed silence. And so when the gun came out, she was not surprised. She was already between him and Cale. She had moved there in the half-second between the weapon appearing and anyone else processing it, because she was positioned to move there, and she had pre-decided to move there if this moment arrived, which was the principle her father had given her at 9 years old. Make your decisions before the moment comes. The moment is too loud to think in. She had made this decision at approximately 1840 yesterday. She stood between Ren's weapon and Cale Doherty, and looked at Ren Aldridge, and kept her hands at her sides because the single most useful thing she could communicate right now was that she was not threatening him, and he did not need to fire. His satellite phone was in his left hand. She saw him press send. Second position. He was calling in the second position. Step aside, Captain. His voice was controlled, professional, the voice of someone who had prepared for this. No, I'm not asking, neither am I. His finger was on the trigger. She tracked the tension in it, not close to full compression, but present, the kind of finger position that was 3 pounds of additional pressure from irreversible. She kept her eyes on his face. Not the gun, the face. Because the hands do what the eyes authorize, and the eyes were doing something she was trying to read in very low light in a high-stakes situation which was harder than it sounded. What she read was delay, not uncertainty, not weakness. Delay, something holding him in the fraction before the decision finalized. She used the fraction Ren, even calm. Not the placating calm of someone trying to manage down a situation. The actual calm of someone who is not afraid of the situation and needs him to know that. You called second position. They're coming. You've done what you came to do. She watched his eyes. You don't need this part. You saw the phone. Yesterday. 1830. He processed that. The timeline of it. What it meant that she'd known for 14 hours and done nothing. Why didn't you? Because I needed to find the warehouse first. She held his gaze. I needed to know what was in it, and I needed Forsyth in a position where he couldn't prevent me from getting to it. A pause. You being here, doing this, that's been useful to me. Not just to whoever sent you. He stared at her. She stared back. And from the dark behind him, 8 feet away, the sound of boots she would have recognized in any environment, in any conditions, because she had listened to those boots for 3 days. Deliberate. Waited. Fully present in every step. Dax Merritt said, "Don't." He was standing in the clothes from the medical bay. IV line removed, the bruise of it already visible at his inner forearm. The chest tube capped and taped, holding his M17 in both hands, with the stability of a man who should not have been capable of standing and was standing anyway through some combination of will, and the specific architecture of a person who had decided this was what was happening, and the body could either cooperate or be overruled. There was a carabiner on his belt, a bag of freeze-dried plasma attached to it. He had pulled his own IV, carabiners his plasma bag to his belt, and walked a kilometer through the Nevada dark on one functional lung. I signed myself out AMA, he said, to the air in general. Someone can sue me later. Ren looked at the M17, looked at Elara, looked at the M17. He lowered his weapon. The second position arrived in 4 minutes. 4 personnel. Light weapons. Private contractor gear, no insignia. No unit identifier, clean and generic and completely wrong for any legitimate government operation. Kowalski and Cale pushed them back in 6 minutes. The contractors withdrew when they lost the element of surprise and encountered organized resistance, which told her they were not committed enough to their objective to absorb casualties, which told her something about how much Whitmore trusted the people he sent. She zip-tied Ren to the base of a ponderosa pine with his own equipment and his own cord, which she considered poetically appropriate, and left Kowalski to watch him. And then she found a flat rock and sat on it and assessed Dax Merritt, who had lowered himself to the ground with the careful management of someone who has been upright longer than was advisable, and is conducting a private negotiation with gravity about the terms of stopping. You walked a kilometer on a hemopneumothorax, she said. I may have also jogged a portion of it, Dax. I'm functional. You have one lung currently providing full respiratory capacity and the other one is still improving. You said so yourself. 93 and climbing. She reached for his wrist, checked his pulse. Still strong, faster than she wanted. Your oxygen saturation is going to drop if you don't. Elara. He put his hand over hers. Briefly. Just long enough to interrupt the medical assessment. I calculated the risk, and I calculated that the risk of you being alone out here with what you know and what you were about to do was higher than the risk of me walking a kilometer with 60% lung capacity. She looked at him, he looked back. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Get me to that warehouse. She gave him 10 minutes. She spent 7 of them on him monitoring, adjusting, making sure the tube was holding, making sure the plasma bag was flowing correctly, making sure he drank water, because dehydration was a compounding factor he probably hadn't accounted for in his risk calculation. He accepted all of this with the minimal resistance of someone who understood they were losing this particular argument. The other 3 minutes she spent on Ren. He was secured and present and looking at the sky with the expression of a man who had moved through his operational decisions and arrived at the part where he waited for what came next. She crouched to his eye level, not to intimidate, to be equal. The warehouse, she said. What's in it? You already know, he said. I know the project name. I know it involves personnel. I know my father's name is on the associated list. She watched his face. Tell me what's in the warehouse. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Something she hadn't seen there before. Not regret. Something adjacent to it. The cousin of regret. The thing that looks like regret from the outside and is actually the recognition that you backed the wrong calculation. Documentation, he said. And proof of location. Location of what? Location of everyone on the clean slate list who was listed as deceased. He held her gaze. Proof they weren't. The night air moved through the pines. She stood. Who sent you here? She said. Whitmore, flat, without hesitation. The tone of someone who has moved past operational secrecy, because the operation is over. My job was to ensure the documentation didn't reach anyone on the wrong list. Whose list is the wrong list? Anyone connected to a Voss, he said. She walked away. The warehouse was a converted mining facility set back from a fire road, corrugated steel exterior with newer ventilation systems installed within the last 5 years. Thermal signatures, 4 personnel clustered toward the rear. The primary target, Carver, was not among them. Carver had never been here. Carver was a paper construct, a designated reason. She and Cale cleared the 4 personnel without gunfire, which required the specific combination of timing and silence and commitment to a plan that she had laid out in her head during the approach, and communicated to Cale in 11 words and hand signals. He executed it correctly. She revised her assessment of him upward again. The secondary steel door was in the back, newer than everything else in the building, out of place in the way that security is always out of place, when it's protecting something that someone wants hidden too obvious, and not obvious enough simultaneously. Cale opened it in 9 minutes. She asked him how later. He said something I picked up. Long story. She said, I want that long story. He said, buy me a beer first. She said, you're 24. He said, I've done things on this deployment that age a person. She conceded the point. The room behind the door was climate controlled, temperature regulated, the kind of environment you maintained for materials you intended to preserve, shelving units, equipment cases. In the center, a fireproof cabinet with a biometric seal, 6 folders, 3 encrypted drives, and a sealed evidence bag. She went through the folders in sequence, clinical, methodical, the way she'd been trained to triage priority order. No skipping, no jumping to conclusions before you'd completed the assessment. Clean slate project designation, 2010-2014. Status, active reduced operational tempo. She read for 14 minutes, and Cale stood at the door, and Dax sat on an overturned equipment case, and neither of them spoke. Clean slate was not a weapons program, not a tactical operation, not any category of activity that lived in the lexicon she'd been operating in for 8 years. It was a containment program, for people, specifically, for military and intelligence personnel who had accrued knowledge of a set of activities conducted between 2009 and 2012 under the authority of a working group operating outside the bounds of congressional oversight that had been deliberately circumvented through a classified mandate, misfiled as a logistics addendum under a Defense Advisory Board designation that sounded, on its surface, like procurement. The activities were not fully detailed in the folder she had access to. But the outcomes were 11 names. 11 people who had been the language used was relocated to extended evaluation status, which was the kind of language that meant something else entirely and knew it and didn't care. She found her father's name on the 7th line Voss, Raymond T., SFC, 75th Ranger Regiment, relocated November 2011. Isolated Facility 7 location, Elko County, Nevada, not deceased, not killed in action, not any of the language she had been given 13 years ago, in a living room in Kerrville, Texas, by a notification officer who had sat on the edge of her mother's couch, with his cover in his hands, and said the words that had divided their lives. Isolated. Status isolated. She read the line 4 times, then she read the location. Elko County, Nevada. She was in Nevada. She looked at the folder, at the date of the most recent status update. 2022. 2 years ago. She looked at the sealed evidence bag. She opened it. A photograph. Color print. Slightly faded at the edges in the way of photographs that had been stored in controlled but not optimal conditions. A man, seated. An institutional room, the chair, the wall behind it, the quality of the lighting, all carrying the specific visual signature of a place designed to house rather than rehabilitate. White hair. Her father's hair had been dark. She had carried that image for 13 years. The dark hair and the cedar smell and the warmth of his hands in the early morning in Texas. And this man's hair was white, fully white. And she almost wasn't sure, almost let herself not be sure except. The scar on his chin, she knew that scar. She had asked about it at age 8. Sitting on the kitchen counter, while her mother made dinner and her father stood in the doorway. Dory with the fond detachment of someone reporting an event that had long since become anecdote rather than memory. A training accident at Fort Benning in 1994. A wire caught wrong at speed, 14 stitches. The scar was the same. His shoulders were still square. After 13 years in a room with no indication of what the world outside was doing, his shoulders were still square. She turned the photograph over. Handwriting. Not her father's. Not Forsyth's. She'd seen Forsyth writing on the briefing documents. Someone else. Careful and deliberate, and written as though the writer understood that someone else would eventually read this, and needed to read it clearly. Still breathing. Location, Facility 7, Elko County. She held the photograph for a long time. Then she put it in her left breast pocket. With the notebook, the two of them together, over her heart. Cale said nothing. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who understood that this was not a moment that required words, and was making the correct choice to not provide any. Dak said Elko County. Yes, how 4 hours and... He was quiet for a moment. Then we have a new objective. She looked at him. He looked back, with complete steadiness. The steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. You told me to trust you, he said. I trust you. That means I'm with you. She held his gaze. Then she looked at Cale. Cale said, I'm in, obviously. I'm clearly in. He paused. I would like the record to show that I am choosing this fully informed and voluntarily. Noted, she said. She turned toward the door, then stopped, because Forsyth was standing in it. He had arrived without sound, without announcement, standing in the doorway of the back room of a warehouse in the Nevada mountains at 4 a.m, with the expression of a man who had been expecting to find exactly this, and had come anyway. He looked at the open cabinet, at the folders on the table, at the photograph-shaped outline in her left breast pocket. 3 things moved across his face in sequence: recognition, resignation, and the third thing, older and more private, that she had no clean name for except to call it the face of someone setting something down that they'd been carrying for a very long time. Sir. Her voice was even. Sit down, he sat. She remained standing. Elko County, she said. Facility 7. He looked at the table. How long have you known he was there? He said nothing. Lieutenant Commander Forsyth. The voice she used when the situation required that she be the authority in the room regardless of rank. How long? Since November 2011, he said. The number landed in the room and sat there. Did you know when you assigned me to this mission? Pause. Yes. Did you build this mission so I would find this room? Longer pause. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long time at the silver temples. The slow eyes. The man who had removed her marksmanship file and given her a medical bag and sent her to the back of every formation for 8 years and built a mission around a warehouse he knew she needed to search. Why couldn't you just tell me, she said. Because Whitmore monitors my communications. Has for 6 years. Any direct contact with you about your father's status would have been flagged within hours. He looked up at her. And because the only way this is actionable, the only way we can use what you've found is if you found it. Through documented operational action. Through a chain that can withstand legal scrutiny. You used me. Yes, and you used Ren. You put him here knowing he'd compromise the operation. I put him here knowing that his presence would give Whitmore a reason to approve the mission. And knowing that when he moved against the team, his capture would be documented. And knowing that a DI asset acting against a legitimate SEAL operation is a federal matter that cannot be quietly managed. His voice was steady, factual. The voice of someone reporting a plan. I needed him caught doing it, with witnesses. She looked at him for a long moment. My father, she said. The status in that file is from 2022, is he still? As of 8 months ago, Forsyth said. Yes, he's alive, she breathed. One full breath, in and out. The photograph, she said, the handwriting on the back. That's yours. He looked at the table. Yes, you put it there 3 years ago. I've been building this for 6 years. Every document in that facility, routed through an access trail that leads to a filing code that connects to this warehouse. Waiting for a moment when I could route the right person to it. He looked up at her. There was no right person for a long time. And then you were assigned to my command, and I read your file. A pause. Your real file, not the one with the thin marksmanship section. She absorbed that. Get up, she said. He looked at her. Get up, she said again. Because I'm going to Elko County, and I need to know if you're going to try to stop me. He stood. No, he said. Are you going to help me? He reached into his jacket, produced a folded paper, held it out. She took it, unfolded it. 8 digits. Service override code for clean slate facilities, he said. It works on a DI access architecture they've been running since 2018. Facility 7 is on the same system. He met her eyes. I've been sitting on that code for 3 years. She looked at it, committed it to memory. Destroyed the paper. She walked to the door. Stopped, didn't turn. A 14-year-old girl sat in a church in Kerrville, Texas, she said, and watched them fold a flag over a box with nothing in it. And she grew up thinking her father was gone. And she chose medicine because she didn't want to be the thing that took him. Her voice was even, controlled, still water over a fast current. And you sat on a code for 3 years. Silence, I know, he said. Then help me bring him home. She walked out. The night was cold and enormous and full of stars. She put her hand flat against her left breast pocket. Against the photograph and the notebook. Against the two of them together over the place in her chest, where something had been very quiet for a very long time. It wasn't quiet anymore. She didn't name it yet, but she let it be loud, and she walked toward the vehicle, and Dax fell into step behind her, slowly and with effort and with absolute certainty, and Cale fell into step behind Dax, lifting his feet, and they drove toward Elko County, toward a man in a room facing east, toward something that 13 years of official record had called finished, which had never been finished, which had been waiting. Elko County was 4 hours away. She drove, not because she was the most rested, she wasn't. Nobody in the vehicle was. The last full sleep cycle any of them had completed was before the first insertion, and that felt like a different decade now. Not because she outranked everyone present, though she did, technically, in the context of this particular vehicle on this particular road, at 4 in the morning. With a chest tube patient in the back seat and a 24-year-old who was reconsidering his life choices in the passenger seat, she drove because she needed to. Because motion was the only container large enough for what was happening in her chest. Because 4 hours was exactly the right amount of time, and she intended to use every minute of it. The road out of Ashford Ridge descended for the first 40 minutes, then flattened into the high desert plateau that connected the ridge system to the broader Nevada basin, long straight stretches of state highway with no median and no shoulder to speak of, and the kind of darkness that only existed at this distance from any city, the kind that made the stars structural rather than decorative, holding up the dome of the sky from the inside like pillars you couldn't see but could feel. Cale was running the satellite maps on a tablet, not the government-issued one, a personal device, ruggedized case, civilian model, connected to a hotspot she hadn't asked about the origin of, and wasn't going to ask about until later. Later was a category she was accumulating. It was getting crowded in there. 14 registered private medical facilities in Elko County, he said, quietly, the voice of someone who had decided that quiet was the correct register for this vehicle at this hour. 3 in the general grid quadrant, Forsyth marked on the overlay. 2 of those have continuous operating records going back before 2011. Send me both coordinates. He did. She looked at them at the next long straight section. The first was northwest, mountains on 3 sides, road access from a single approach. The kind of geography that was defensible but also isolating in ways that would complicate regular resupply. The second was east, lower elevation, road access from 2 directions, and she thought about the thermal signature of a building that received morning sun on its east face. The way certain exposures caught light earlier than others at this latitude in September. East, she said. Cale looked at the tablet, then at her. That's not it. It's the second one, the east facility. How? She thought about how to explain it in terms that didn't require her to explain everything, then decided that they were past the point where incomplete explanations were useful. He was trained to orient toward the east in the morning, she said. Any containment facility running a pharmaceutical suppression program would need to manage patient agitation through environmental controls, light exposure, routine, predictable sensory input. A facility that understood what it was housing would put him in a room with eastern exposure. Because eastern exposure means morning light, and morning light means something consistent to orient to. She looked at the road. He taught me that. Always know where the light is coming from, even in the dark. Cale was quiet for a moment. East it is, he said. From the back seat, Dak said nothing, which meant he was either asleep, unlikely, or thinking certain, or managing something physical that he didn't want to advertise, also likely. She checked him in the rear view. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. How's your breathing? She said. Fine, on a fine, Elara. She looked at the road. He was not fine. He was functioning within the acceptable range of not immediately dying, which for Dak's merit registered as fine, and she had learned over 3 days that the distinction between those 2 things in his vocabulary was approximately the distance between a medical fact and a personal position, and he had staked out his position, and she was going to have to respect it and monitor him simultaneously, which she was doing. She thought about her mother. She always thought about her mother when she was driving alone at night, which was a pattern she'd noticed and never analyzed too carefully, because some patterns revealed things you weren't ready to know. But tonight she was ready, or she was past the point where ready was a relevant gate. Margaret Voss, 58 years old, still in the Kerrville house, the one with the 2 live oaks that had grown into each other overhead since Ray Voss had planted them as saplings in 1996, the year before Elara was born, the year he came back from Somalia and decided he wanted to plant something that would take time. She had never thought about that before, that he'd planted them after Somalia. That a man who had seen what he saw in Mogadishu in October 1993 had come home and planted trees, because planting trees was the act of a person who believed in a future, long enough to invest in something they might not live to see fully grown. She thought about what that said about who her father was. Then she thought about what it meant that the live oaks were fully grown now, and her mother tended them the way she tended everything she decided to keep, with focused, deliberate, unapologetic care, and her father hadn't seen them, hadn't been allowed to see them. She pressed her teeth together once. Released, breathed. Mag had never remarried, had never, to Elara's knowledge, seriously entertained the idea. She had a full life, her work, her garden, her friends, the book group that met on Thursday evenings, and had been meeting on Thursday evenings for 11 years. The twice-yearly trips to see her sister in Scottsdale, that Elara suspected were as much about having somewhere to be Mag without context as they were about family. She was not a woman defined by her loss. She was a woman who had built a complete life around a specific shape of absence. The way you build a room around a window, not filling it, not pretending it wasn't there, but making the room livable by taking the window into account. 2 places at the table, every day for 13 years. Elara thought, Mom, I'm going to call you in a few hours, and what I have to tell you is going to reorganize everything, and I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry I didn't find this before. I'm sorry I believed the official record even while not believing it, which is its own kind of failure, the failure of not pushing hard enough, not asking the right questions, not following the thread far enough, she thought. And then I'm going to stop apologizing because you will tell me to stop and you will be right, she thought. Dad, I'm coming. They stopped once. A gas station in a town with a single stoplight, and a diner that was dark, and a population that seemed to have collectively agreed not to be awake at 3 a.m., which was a reasonable agreement. She filled the tank. Cale went inside and came back with coffee in 3 paper cups that smelled like the coffee had been sitting since the previous morning, and were perfect. She drank hers, standing beside the vehicle in the cold air. Dax had gotten out. Against her unspoken recommendation and his own physical advisability, he was standing at the front of the vehicle with his coffee, and his chest tube taped under his shirt, and his face turned up toward the stars with the expression of a man reacquainting himself with the fact that the sky was still there. She stood beside him, not talking, not needing to. After a minute he said, "I should have pushed on that name when I heard it in 2015. You didn't know. I knew enough to file it differently than I did." She looked at the stars. The filing system we use for incomplete information is always wrong in hindsight. That's generous. It's accurate. She drank her coffee. If you'd pushed on it in 2015, you might have triggered something that moved him. Or worse. She looked at him sideways. Forsyth spent 6 years building the right approach. And even he, she stopped. Even he. She thought about the 3 years, the code sitting unused, the calculation Forsyth had been running and running and running. Even he made judgment calls I don't entirely forgive, she said. But I understand, which is different from forgiving, but it's where I am right now. Dax absorbed this. Where you'll be later. Ask me later. He nodded, drank his coffee, looked at the stars for another moment. Then he's going to be different. She didn't ask who. I know. 13 years is... I know, Dax. You've read the research on long-term pharmaceutical isolation. I wrote a paper on it at Fort Bragg. She finished her coffee. Extended exposure to dissociative suppressants targeting episodic memory. The hippocampal degradation. The emotional anchoring disruption. She crushed the cup. I know what I'm walking into. He looked at her. Do you, he said, not a challenge. A genuine question. She looked at the dark horizon where the mountains were shapes rather than details. I know what the research says, she said. I don't know what it looks like when it's him. Dax put his hand briefly on her shoulder, then took it away. They got back in the vehicle. She drove. They found it at 517. Not a hospital, not visibly. A low complex of buildings set back 300 meters from a 2-lane road. Accessed by a gravel drive that was maintained just well enough to not attract attention by its condition. A sign at the gate in institutional font, Ridgecrest Neurological Care Center. The kind of name that was sufficiently specific to sound legitimate and sufficiently generic to invite no further inquiry. The perimeter fence was 12 feet, galvanized steel posts, installed within the last 4 years, based on the oxidation level of the joint fittings. Camera mounts at 40-meter intervals. She counted 8 visible on the approach, noted the mounting bracket thickness on the 3rd post from the left and the 8th from the right, which were slightly wider than standard, and therefore not decorative. 10 cameras total, not 8. The guard at the gate was in unmarked contractor gear, no insignia, clean and generic, carrying a sidearm in a drop-leg holster that was not standard medical facility configuration by any definition. She pulled over a quarter-mile back. 4 cameras, Cale said. 10, she said. 2 concealed in posts 3 and 8. The bracket profiles are wider than standard by approximately 4 millimeters, enough to house a secondary housing unit behind the primary mount. Cale looked harder. I still don't. My father drove me past a government facility when I was 10. Field trip. He pointed out the secondaries without breaking conversation. Said, the ones they want you to see are never the ones that matter. She studied the rotation pattern. 19-second cycle. 2-second gap at the northeast corner where adjacent camera arcs diverged. We have 2 seconds at the northeast corner, between camera rotations. Cale did the math. That's not a lot of time. No. For what it's worth, he said, I have been lifting my feet. She looked at him. In case that affects the calculation, he said. It did actually. She factored it. You go first. Northeast corner. I'll count you through. Move on my mark. Dax said. From the back, I'll take the vehicle around to the service access on the south side. If the facility runs standard emergency evacuation routing, the south exit will be the secondary egress. He said it with complete calm. The calm of a man who had identified his contribution and was committing to it and was not going to have an argument about it. She looked at him in the rear view. Your job is to drive the vehicle and wait, she said. My job, he said, is whatever keeps this operation functional, which right now is covering your exit. He met her eyes in the mirror. I'm not walking the fence, Elara. I'm sitting in a vehicle 40 meters from an exit door. That is, medically speaking, sitting down. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then looked at the fence. On my mark, she said. She counted the rotation, 19 seconds. The cameras moved in sequence, not simultaneous, offset by approximately 2 seconds per unit, which meant the gap at the northeast corner was real and consistent and exploitable. Mark, she said. Cale went. She watched him clear the fence in 4 seconds. 1 second over target. She made a note. 3 seconds. She made a note about that too. Inside, she oriented immediately. The main building was single-story at the front, rising to 2 at the rear, the newer construction, matching the fence posts, matching the camera infrastructure. The 2-story rear section had been added at a different time than the original building. The roofline junction visible even in the pre-dawn dark as a change in material and angle. The light. At the far east end of the 2-story section's second floor, a thin line under a door. Not a window, there were no windows on the east face of the second floor, which was itself information. The kind of architectural choice you made when you didn't want the people inside to have access to natural light cycles on their own terms. The thin line was door bottom clearance. Someone had left a light on inside, or someone needed the light on, because the dark had been too long. Because certain adjustments happened to the nervous system after extended periods of artificially managed light exposure. Certain dependencies, certain calibrations that shifted the baseline until the absence of light became not peaceful but threatening. She had read about this. She had read about it 3 times on 3 separate occasions. And each time she had put the research down after a certain number of pages because the clinical language had a way of temporarily failing to hold the weight of what it was describing. She went toward the light. The service override accepted the code on the first entry. No alarm. The panel confirmed access with a single green indicator and the door released with a sound like a held breath being let go. She stood in the corridor for 3 full seconds, not hesitating, assessing linoleum floor buffed to a low shine, walls in a pale institutional green that someone had chosen decades ago and no one had ever changed, because changing it would have required someone to care about the interior experience of the people housed here, and caring about that was not the program. 11 doors. Closed. She walked east. She walked the way her father had taught her to walk in enclosed spaces with unknown occupancy. Heel placement first, weight transfer slow, eyes on the far end, peripheral attention covering the immediate doors, the old rhythm, the one she didn't have to think about. The light was under the last door, room 11. She stood outside it for a moment. She thought, whatever is on the other side of this door, you are the same person who drove 4 hours and climbed a fence and used a code and walked 11 doors. You don't stop being that person when the door opens. She thought, he may not know you. That is a documented clinical outcome of long-term suppressive pharmaceutical intervention. That is a medical fact. It is not a judgment on anything that exists between you. She thought, open the door. She opened the door. He was sitting in a chair by the far wall, facing east. His back was to her. She saw his shoulders first, the line of them square against the back of the chair, not in the performative way of someone maintaining a posture, but in the way of a body whose baseline was this, whose resting state had been shaped over so many years into this specific alignment that it had stopped being a choice and become a fact of the body. His hair was white. She had been preparing for this. She had looked at the photograph 40 times in the vehicle, making herself look at the white hair, making herself update the image she'd been carrying. 13 years of an image is a long time. The image had weight. It resisted updating. But she had made herself do it, and still, the first sight of it, the white, at the back of his head, against the institutional lighting, the specific quality of someone who had gone white, not gradually, but in the way that happens when the body processes, something too large for incremental change, still arrived in her chest, as something that needed a moment. She gave it the moment. He didn't turn when she entered. His hands were resting on his knees, not tense, not restless. The hands of someone who had learned to be still because movement without purpose in a small space was its own kind of damage. You're early for morning rounds, he said, his voice. She had not heard her father's voice in 13 years. She had heard it in memory, in the specific way that auditory memory works imperfectly, with gaps. The tone generally preserved but the texture losing resolution over time, the way a photograph fades unevenly. She had heard the memory of his voice and known she was hearing a degraded copy and been unable to do anything about the degradation. This was not degraded, this was his voice, lower than the memory, worn in the way that voices wore when they'd spent years in small rooms with limited conversation. but unmistakably, completely, entirely his. She couldn't speak for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which she stood in the doorway of a facility in Elko County, Nevada, with her hand still on the doorframe, and did not speak, because the voice had taken whatever she'd been about to say, and replaced it with nothing. "Then I'm not here for rounds," she said. He turned, and she saw his face, and the thing that happened in her chest was not something that had a name in any clinical literature she had ever read, not in the research on grief or reunion, or the neurological processing of long-anticipated moments. Not in any of the frameworks she'd spent 8 years building and maintaining and leaning on. It was larger than the frameworks. She let it be larger. His face was her father's face. Older. The lines deeper, the skin differently textured from years of indoor living. The color of someone who had not been in direct sunlight regularly for a very long time. The scar on his chin, the same. The line of his jaw, the same. His eyes gray-blue and still moving with the cataloging attention of someone who processed new stimuli as a matter of trained reflex rather than choice. He looked at her. She stood still and let him look. And she watched him not know her. She watched it happen in real time. The scan that was professional rather than personal. The assessment of a new element in a familiar environment. The polite attention of a man who had been seen by enough medical personnel over enough years that the appearance of an unfamiliar face in his doorway registered as routine variation rather than significance. She had prepared for this. It arrived anyway, like something dropped from a height. Not painful, not yet. Later it would be painful. Right now it was just clarifying. The final clarification of what 13 years of pharmaceutical management had done to a man who had once stood in a backyard in Texas at dawn and told his 9-year-old daughter that the mountains didn't care who she was. He didn't know her. She was going to change that. "Are you the new doctor?" he said. "No," she said. She stepped into the room. Let the door close behind her. Kept her voice level. Not clinical, not artificially warm. Just present. "I'm not a doctor. Nurse? Medic. Combat medic, 68W. She said it the way you said something that you needed to land in a specific place. Not in the top register of memory, where the pharmaceutical suppression had done its work. Deeper, in the place where training lived. In the place where identity was stored not as narrative but as reflex." Something moved in his face when she said it. Below the surface, small and fast, she caught it. She had her father's eyes. She had always been able to catch the things he couldn't entirely contain. 68W, he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. The reaching was visible. The effort of trying to locate something, a name, a connection, a thread that his mind kept losing before it reached the surface. She knew what that was. She knew it clinically, and now she knew it personally. And the distance between those two kinds of knowing was the distance between a photograph and the thing itself. Then a door closed behind the reaching. The pharmaceutical management doing what it had been designed to do, intercepting the connection before it completed. She reached into her left breast pocket. The notebook was there. She had carried it for 9 years. She had carried it through Fort Bragg and 6 deployments, and 3 field hospitals, and 1 very bad night in a ranger station in Ashford Ridge, and 4 hours of driving through Nevada darkness with her father's photograph next to it over her heart. She took it out, and she walked to him slowly. The way you walk towards something that needed to know you were not a threat. That needed time. That had spent 13 years in a room where the approach of an unfamiliar person meant something specific and rarely comfortable. She pulled the second chair close, sat in front of him, at his level, eye to eye, and she opened the notebook. First page, his handwriting, dense and deliberate and every letter constructed rather than written. "The rifle doesn't lie, Elara. Only people do." She turned to the back page, the last page, the one she had never read in front of another person. The one that was hers specifically, and had always been hers specifically, and which she was choosing now to use as a key, because there was no other key, and because if anything could reach the place the medication couldn't, it was this. A birthday message, for a 10-year-old girl in Texas. "To Elara, who asks better questions than I have answers for, who shoots straighter than I taught her to, and who will one day do something I couldn't. Happy birthday. I love you more than the distance to any target I ever found. Don't let them make you small. Dad." She placed the notebook in his hands. Both of his hands, open, palms up. She placed it carefully, the way you placed something irreplaceable. He looked down at it. He read the first page. She watched his face. He turned to the back page. He read. She watched the reading happen, his eyes moving across the lines. Slowly at first, the pace of someone for whom reading had become effortful, the processing slowed by everything that had been done to his neurology, and then slower still, the way reading slows when the words are not being processed at the surface level, but at some deeper level where processing was not the right word, where the word was something more like recognition. His hands tightened on the notebook. She saw it. A fractional increase in grip pressure that a stranger would not notice, and she noticed because she had been watching his hands since she sat down. He read the last line again. Don't let them make you small. His lips moved, just the shape of the words. Silent, and then the silence of a man who has read a sentence he wrote and found it arriving in him differently than it arrived when he wrote it, finding it changed by everything that had happened in the distance between the writing and the reading. He was very still. The stillness she knew. The stillness between heartbeats, the one he had taught her to find. Not calm. Still, the mechanical stillness of everything pausing. He looked up. He looked at her, and she watched the light come in, not switched on, not sudden. The way light came into a room through a gap in curtains, that someone was slowly opening present before you registered it, and then more present, and then undeniable, and then so obviously there, that you couldn't account for not having seen it immediately. His eyes changed. Something that had been absent, not gone, not destroyed, not erased but suppressed, held under, managed into a kind of dormancy. Something came back into his eyes and it looked at her. Elara, he said, her name, in her father's voice, with 13 years of everything that word contained accumulated behind it, stored somewhere the medication hadn't reached, in whatever substrate the human person used to hold the things it would not give up. She said, "Hi, Dad." And the 13 years were still there, all of them. They were not erased by the moment. They were not undone or resolved or collapsed into nothingness by the fact of his recognition. 13 years of a folded flag over an empty box, and a mother who set 2 places at a table, and a daughter who became a medic instead of a shooter, and who carried a notebook in her left breast pocket and checked it in the dark the way she checked her medical bag, every item confirmed, every item present, every item accounted for. All of that was still there. But so was this. Both things were true simultaneously, and she found, to her surprise, that the space was large enough for both. She put her hand over his on the notebook. He turned his hand over and held on. She let him hold on for a long time. She was a medic. She knew that recovery was not a moment. It was a direction. Right now the direction was correct and everything else could be addressed in order, which was how she's approached every situation with multiple simultaneous demands. Assess. Prioritize. Address in sequence. She assessed him while she sat with him. She couldn't not. It was the mechanism of her attention, the default mode of 8 years of training running in the background of everything else. Muscle tone, diminished but present. The posture told her he had maintained some form of physical discipline. Not exercise in any formal sense, the facility would not have permitted that, but the micro-habits of someone who refused to let the body go entirely. Isometric effort. The deliberate maintenance of the square shoulders even when it would have been easier not to. Eyes, tracking well. Pupillary response to the changed light when she'd opened the door, normal. Cognitive processing, slowed but sequential. He was following the conversation. He was generating responses that were contextually appropriate. The pharmaceutical suppression had targeted specific memory formation pathways. And emotional anchoring, the medication class she'd identified from the clinical indicators, was consistent with a compound designed to prevent the formation of new, long-term memories and disrupt retrieval of emotionally encoded existing ones. But the baseline architecture was intact. The person was intact, suppressed, not destroyed. This was recoverable. She was already planning the treatment approach in the part of her mind that ran in parallel to the rest of the moment. Who she needed to call, what facility, what specialist, what the tapering protocol looked like for this class of compound, what the monitoring requirements were in the first 4 weeks. She was going to need a neurologist she trusted who had no Department of Defense connections. She was going to need to get him out of Nevada. She was going to need to call her mother before Mag heard this from anyone else or in any other sequence. She filed all of this. Then she let it run in the background. Because right now, in the foreground, her father was holding her hand in a room in Elko County, Nevada, and reading the back page of his own notebook for the second time, and she was not going to manage that into a task list. "You're here," he said. "Still checking." confirming at intervals the way the brain confirmed things it was having difficulty holding in continuous certainty. I'm here. How long have I? He stopped, the question too large for the version of the answer he had access to. 13 years, she said, gently, directly, because he deserved the direct answer and she was not going to soften it into something smaller than it was. He was quiet for a long time. Your mother, he said. She doesn't know yet. He absorbed this. She's good, Dad. She's okay. She held his hand a little more firmly. She didn't remarry. She's still in the house. The live oaks are fully grown. Something moved in his face, large enough that he couldn't control all of it. He looked at the middle distance for a moment with the expression of a man receiving information that reorganizes a landscape he's been holding in his mind as fixed. She tended them, he said. She tends everything she's decided to keep. He closed his eyes. She let him. When he opened them again, he said, How did you find me? Long story. I have time. A pause. A breath. And then, so quietly that she almost missed it, wrapped in the specific dry patience of a man who had been in a small room for 13 years. Apparently, I've had quite a lot of it. She almost laughed. The almost of it surprised her. Came up from somewhere she hadn't known, was still warm. And then she let it, because laughing here, in this room, at this specific dark quiet joke, was not inappropriate. It was exactly right. It was the sound of something resuming. We'll have more time, she said after. Getting him out required 14 minutes and two personnel interventions she handled with the efficient calm of someone who had decided that the moral weight of what she was doing was on the correct side of any line she was willing to draw. The first overnight staff member she encountered in the corridor accepted her explanation. Federal Medical Review, emergency protocol, authorization code provided, the code being the same service override that had opened the entrance panel, and which apparently operated all access points in the facility, which was either poor security architecture or evidence that the facility's designers had not anticipated anyone ever having the code. The second she didn't need to encounter, because Cale appeared from the direction of the staff workroom, looking composed in the specific way of someone who has just finished a task that required a skill set he was not going to itemize, and said clear quietly, and held the corridor door open. She was going to get the full accounting of Cale Doherty's supplementary skill set at some point. She was looking forward to it. Her father walked, slowly, with the gait adjustment of someone relearning the distance between their body and the world outside a familiar space. The unconscious recalibration of a person who had been in a room of specific dimensions for long enough that the body had settled into those dimensions and was now being asked to adjust to dimensions that were larger. It looked like hesitation. It wasn't. It was recalibration. She stayed at his left side, not holding, not supporting, just there, close enough to be there if he needed it, far enough to not presuppose that he did. He glanced at her once, sideways, the exact look she remembered from the backyard in Texas. The look he used for things he was assessing without wanting to appear to assess. The observational habit of a man who had spent so many years processing the world as potential information that observation had become the default mode of simply existing in it. You said combat medic, he said. Yes. Which unit? SEAL Team 7 support billet. 3 years. He processed this. 3 steps. The white hair moving slightly with the motion. That's not what I put in your file. She kept her voice even. No, it's not. I put you for I had a specific. I know what you put me for. She looked at the door at the end of the corridor, at the thin line of pre-dawn light coming through the exterior seal. I chose different. He walked 2 more steps, then stopped. She stopped with him. He turned and looked at her with his full attention. Not the checking look, not the confirming look, but the complete focused attention she remembered from the moments in the backyard when she'd said something that required his full engagement to respond to correctly. Why? He said. She looked at the door, at the light underneath it. Because I thought the rifle took you, she said, and I didn't want to carry the thing that took you. He was very still. She felt him looking at her. Elara, he said. Yeah. The rifle didn't take me. I know that now. People took me. I know. And you, he stopped, started again. The pharmaceutical suppression making the retrieval effortful, the chain of thought needing to be rebuilt rather than recalled. You carried the medical bag instead. Yes. For 8 years. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hand on her shoulder. The way he'd stood behind her in the backyard, the specific weight and placement of his hand, the simple fact of it, the contact that didn't grip or pull or manage but simply confirmed. I'm here, I see you. I know you. She put her hand over his. They stood in a corridor in a facility in Elko County, Nevada, at 5:37 in the morning with the pre-dawn light coming under the door and her father's hand on her shoulder and 13 years between them that were not gone and not unreal, but were, for the first time, something she could stand on both sides of simultaneously. Then they walked. Dax was outside the vehicle. He should not have been outside the vehicle. He had been assigned to the vehicle. She had specified clearly that his role was to sit in the vehicle and exist in a medically advisable configuration until she returned. He was outside the vehicle, standing in the gravel of the service access road, with his coffee from the gas station, still somehow not fully cold, and his chest tube taped under his shirt, and his weight distributed slightly left because the right side cost him more to breathe from, and he was managing the cost. He looked at Ray Voss. Ray Voss looked at him. The two of them looked at each other for a moment, with the specific quality of men who are performing mutual assessment in a compressed time frame and are both experienced enough to do it efficiently. Dax said, "SFC Voss, Chief Petty Officer Dax Merritt." Ray looked at him, the slow cataloging attention. "Then you look like hell, Chief." "Dax, so do you, sir." Ray considered this. "Fair." Something happened in Elara's chest again. The same thing that had been happening all night. Larger now, warmer. The thing she still didn't have a clean name for but had stopped trying to name and was simply letting exist. Cale appeared at her right shoulder. He looked at Ray, looked at Elara, looked at Ray again. "Yes," she said. He stood with this for a moment. Then, "Okay, a breath?" "Yeah." She appreciated that he left it there. Forsyth was at the rest stop 40 miles west, alone, standing outside his vehicle with his hands in his jacket pockets and the posture of a man who had been standing in the cold for long enough to have made peace with it. He saw the vehicle pull in. He saw Elara get out. He saw Ray Voss get out of the back seat. What happened in Forsyth's face when he saw Ray Voss was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on that face. Not relief, not guilt, though those were present somewhere beneath it. What was most visible was the face of someone confronting the actual human weight of a decision they had made at a desk 13 years ago when it was paperwork, when it was a calculation, when it was a name on a list, and seeing that decision standing in gravel outside a rest stop in Nevada at dawn, white-haired and square-shouldered and real. Ray looked at him for a long time. Forsyth looked back. She did not intervene. "This was not hers," Brennan Ray said. Forsyth said, "Ray, you look older. You've been gone 13 years, not entirely by choice." The last sentence landed without inflection, without accusation, which made it more precise than an accusation would have been. Forsyth looked at the ground, then up. "No," he said. "It wasn't." "Ray, did you build the mission?" Forsyth, "Yes." "Ray, to bring her here?" Forsyth, "Yes." Ray looked at Elara. He looked back at Forsyth. "Why didn't you do it sooner?" Not raised, not hard, quiet and exact. The voice of a man who had spent 13 years in a small room and had done a great deal of thinking in it, and had arrived at questions that were very specific. Forsyth took the question full. He didn't deflect it. "I didn't have a clean channel until 2021, he said. "And I needed it to be her. Documented. Actionable. If I'd brought it forward through any official line, Whitmore would have he stopped. The only version of this that holds up is the one she found herself, through an operation that's fully on record." Ray was quiet for a long moment. Then Whitmore. "In federal custody by 900 this morning," Forsyth said. "My testimony, hers. The documentation from the warehouse, the capture of his DIA asset in the commission of an operation against a legitimate SEAL element." He paused. "It's enough, it's more than enough." Ray looked at the horizon. The mountains to the east were becoming shapes rather than darkness. "My family," he said, "will be fully briefed through official channels within 48 hours, Forsyth said. "Your status correction is already filed. As of 600 today, your official record will reflect active duty interrupted rather than killed in action." He paused. "Retroactive pay and benefits will follow." Ray absorbed this. He looked at Elara. She looked back. "You did this," he said. "Forsyth built it," she said. "You did this," he said again. She didn't argue a second time. He was in a proper hospital bed by 800. She had identified the right physician during the drive to the hospital, a civilian neurologist at the Elko Regional Medical Center, whose career had no Department of Defense intersections, whose research on pharmaceutical suppression recovery was the paper she had cited most frequently in her own readings on the subject, and who answered her call at 6:17 in the morning with the alert attention of someone who took incoming calls at that hour as a matter of professional expectation. Dr. Constance Abernethy, 61. The kind of voice that conveyed that she had heard a great deal and was unlikely to be destabilized by hearing more. Elara told her what she needed to tell her. Dr. Abernethy said, "Bring him in." The assessment took 2.5 hours. Elara stayed for all of it. Her father answered questions with the careful specificity of a man who was aware that his access to his own answers was variable and was not willing to substitute approximations for the real thing. He described gaps. He described the quality of the retrieval difficulty, not the absence of memory but the interrupted access to it, the sense of reaching for something that was there but behind glass. "It's like," he said, at one point, "searching for the right comparison, calling a number you know, and getting the busy signal. The number exists, the line is there, but something is blocking the connection." Dr. Abernethy made notes. Elara made her own note. In the private ledger she kept for things that mattered. At one point, Dr. Abernethy asked him what year he thought it was. He was quiet for a moment, not uncertain about the answer, working toward it methodically. "My daughter is 27, he said. "She was born in 1997. A pause, so it's 2024. He had known her age, without uncertainty, without retrieval difficulty. He had known her age and used it as an anchor point for orienting himself in time. She looked at the floor, made another note. He knew my age without reaching for it. The medication took his short-term formation and disrupted his emotional anchoring. It did not take her. Dax came by at noon, in a wheelchair, at the insistence of the nursing staff who had correctly assessed him as a man who would not stay in bed of his own volition and had deployed the wheelchair as a compromise position that allowed him to move while limiting the degree to which he was upright. He wheeled himself to the door of Ray's room. Ray was asleep. His first real sleep. Dr. Abernethy had said the facility's pharmaceutical protocol had included compounds that disrupted natural sleep architecture, and the tapering that began this morning would gradually restore the normal cycle. But right now his body was taking sleep the way it was available. Dax looked at him sleeping. Elara came to the door. "How is he?" Dax said. She told him, accurate, specific, the clinical picture and the contextual one, the recovery trajectory and the uncertainties within it, the things she knew for certain and the things she was estimating. When she finished, Dax looked at her, with the expression she had been cataloging since the LZ, the one she'd finally had sufficient time and context to fully read. It was the look of someone who had updated their assessment of another person so significantly that they were running the update process visibly. "You were never just a medic," he said. She had been waiting for some version of this. She had known it was coming since the LZ. "I was always just a medic," she said, "who happened to also be a very good shot." He evaluated the statement, let it sit. "Fair enough," he said, "Captain." The word landed differently than it had 3 days ago. She wasn't sure yet exactly how it landed differently. But she noticed. KL found her in the corridor at 1400. He had the expression of someone who had been running the last 48 hours through a processing loop and had arrived at some preliminary conclusions. He stood in the hallway, with his hands in his jacket pockets. He'd acquired a jacket somewhere. Civilian, too large, almost certainly Forsyth's, and looked at her with the frank attention of someone who had decided they were past the point of social management. "Are you okay?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think I'm going to be." He nodded. Then, for what it's worth, he paused. "I've been lifting my feet, since you told me, every step. I counted them on the way in this morning." She looked at him. "I counted 214 steps from the parking lot to this corridor," he said, "and I lifted my feet for every single one of them. I want that on record." This time the laugh came all the way. Not loud, not long, but real. Rising from somewhere she hadn't been sure still existed after the weight of the last 3 days. From the place that her father had told her to protect. "Don't let them make you small, Elara, and don't let them take the parts of you that can still find things funny, because those parts are load-bearing, those parts are structural." He hadn't said all of that, but she was saying it now with his voice in her memory, and it was close enough to what he would have said. "That's on record," she said. Cale grinned, briefly, then went back to looking like a young man who had done things in the last 48 hours that had added a few years to his face and was deciding whether that was a loss or a gain. She thought gain, obviously, but she didn't say it. He needed to arrive there himself. She called her mother at 1630. She sat in the family consultation room, pale walls, neutral furniture, the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long, the specific acoustic quality of a room designed to absorb difficult conversations. And she put both feet on the floor and both hands on her knees, and she called. 3 rings. 4. Mag Voss picked up on the 4th with the alert, present quality of someone who had never, in Elara's memory, answered the phone, as though the call might be nothing. Elara, Mom, 1 beat, just 1. I need you to sit down. Silence, the kind that was not making a very fast and very complete assessment of tone and context and history. Are you hurt? Mag said. No. Are you safe? Yes. I'm in a hospital in Elko County, Nevada, and I'm safe, and I need you to sit down. Another silence. And then Mag Voss did the thing she always did when she was processing something large. She went very quiet, in the specific way of a woman deciding not to fill the space until she knew what the space required. Elara Jane Voss, she said, very quietly. What did you do? There it was. The exact phrasing, the full name. The tone that was not accusation but was its first cousin, the tone that meant, I know you did something significant and I know I'm about to find out what. The laugh came again. Even smaller this time. More internal than external. Mom, she said. Tell me. I found him. The silence that followed those 3 words was the longest she had ever experienced on a phone line. Not dead air. She could hear her mother breathing, could hear the quality of the breathing change, could hear the specific moment when Mag Voss stopped breathing normally and started breathing around something. Elara, her voice had changed, lower, careful, the voice of someone holding a position at the edge of something and not yet sure if it was solid ground. What are you saying? He's alive, Mom. Clear, direct. The clean delivery of a fact that deserved not to be softened or built toward or arrived at gradually. He's here. He's okay. They kept him, Mom. 13 years. But he's alive and he's here and he's going to be okay. She pressed her lips together once, released. He knew how old I was, without looking it up, without being prompted. He just knew. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the sound she had heard 3 times in her entire life. Mag Voss crying. Not breaking, not collapsing, not the loud grief sound of someone losing their structure. The quiet, controlled, long-suppressed release of someone who has been holding something at exactly the right tension for 13 years. And has just been told they can put it down. She sat with it. She did not rush it. She did not fill it. She let her mother have every second of it. When the breathing steadied, and it did, because it always did, because Mag Voss was made of something that steadied, it was the baseline material of the woman. She said, I need to see him. I know. I need to see him right now. I know, Mom. Drive to Austin. There's a direct flight to Reno. I'll have someone meet you at the airport with a sign. A pause. Who? His name is Cale. He's young. He has a jacket that's too big for him. You'll recognize him. Mag was quiet for a moment. Then the live oaks. What about them? They're going to need to know. Her voice was completely steady now. The steadiness that had always been the most astonishing thing about her mother, how fast she arrived at it, how completely. Isn't that ridiculous? I've been talking to those trees for 13 years, reporting to them. I need to. She stopped. Never mind. It's not ridiculous, Elara said. No, Mag said. It's not, is it? No. A breath. Elara. One more time. Her name, the original frequency, the first sound she had ever known. He's really there. He's really here, Mom. He's in room 14 on the 2nd floor and he's asleep right now, but he knew my age without being told, and his shoulders are still straight. Silence. Of course they are, Mag said. She heard her mother stand up, heard the specific quality of someone moving, with purpose, through a house she knew the layout of completely, the kitchen, the hallway, the bedroom where the car keys lived on the hook. Her father had put in the wall in 1996, because Mag kept misplacing them, and he had solved the problem structurally. I'll be there tomorrow morning, Mag said. I know. Don't let him go anywhere, Mom. I know he's in a hospital. A breath. Don't let him go anywhere. He's not going anywhere, Mom. None of us are going anywhere. A pause. Come back to me, Mag said. The same 2 words. The driveway. The 2 small leave oaks. Her daughter leaving for Fort Bragg. The words that meant everything a mother could mean and didn't have room to say. Except now they meant all 3 of them. We will, Elara said. Mom, we will. She sat in the consultation room for a few minutes after the call, not thinking, not planning, not filing or assessing or building a list of next steps, just sitting, in the quiet. The afternoon light through the window was the late September specific lower angle, warmer color, the kind of light that made ordinary things look considered. The edge of the table, the arm of the chair, the window frame itself. Everything ordinary and specific and real. She reached into her left breast pocket, took out the notebook, opened to the last page. Read the words she had read more times than she could count, in more contexts than she'd ever imagined when she first received them. On a birthday in Texas when she was 10 years old, and her father had handed her a notebook and said, "I wrote something in the back. Read it when you need to. Don't let them make you small." She sat with the sentence, with what it had meant at 10, with what it had meant at 14 when the notification officer sat on the couch, with what it had meant at 22 when she'd passed the marksmanship evaluation. They hadn't recorded and chosen the medical bag anyway. With what it had meant last night at 780 meters in the dark, with one hand on her father's rifle and the other on the seal she'd placed on his chest. With what it meant now. She closed the notebook, put it back in her pocket, stood up, walked back to room 14. He was awake, sitting up, looking at the window. The sun was lower now, coming from the west, which was the wrong direction, not his direction, not the direction he'd been orienting to for 13 years in a room, with no windows, but he was watching it anyway, with the specific quality of attention he had always given to things he hadn't seen in a long time. Not examining, not analyzing, just being present to them. He heard her come in. "She's coming," Elara said. He didn't look away from the window, but his hands resting on the blanket shifted. A small movement, the kind that contained a great deal. "How long?" he said. "Tomorrow morning. She's leaving in about 20 minutes, I'd guess." A breath. "She'll drive to the airport. She'll drive to Austin. Flight to Reno. Someone will meet her. She hates flying. She'll get on the plane." "Yes," he said. "She will." A pause. "She would drive if she thought she could get here faster." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The live oaks. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She said they needed to know. Something moved in his face. The same thing from the corridor, the large thing he couldn't entirely control. He looked at the window. "I planted those the year before you were born," he said. "I came back from Somalia and I planted trees." "I know." "I wanted," he stopped. "I wanted there to be something, still growing, in case, she said. Yes. She thought about what that meant. About a 29-year-old man coming home from Mogadishu in 1993 and kneeling in the Texas soil to plant 2 saplings that would grow into each other overhead and create something like a canopy over the front walk of a house on a street he'd chosen because it had good sight lines, and also because Mag had loved the neighborhood, and love was a better reason than tactics. About the way planting trees was the act of someone who believed in the future, even when the future was not guaranteed. Even knowing, as he must have known at some level, as anyone in his position must have known, that the future could be interrupted, he had planted them anyway. "They're fully grown," she said. "They've grown into each other. There's a canopy now over the front walk." He was quiet for a long time. "Good," he said. "Quiet. Just that. Good." She reached over, put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held on. The same way he'd held on in room 11, the same grip, the same confirmation. She held on back. Outside, the light continued its indifferent westward movement, not caring about the room it was leaving, not caring about what had happened in it, not caring about the 13 years, the warehouse, the notebook, the photograph, the fence, the corridor, the 780 meters in the dark, the code, the 4 hours of driving through Nevada darkness, the consultation room, the phone call, the 2 live oaks still growing in Texas. The mountains didn't care who you were, but the light came anyway. It always came. And her father was looking at it. And her mother was in a car on a highway in Texas driving toward an airport. And somewhere in a hallway outside this room, Cale Doherty was walking with his feet lifted, all the way to the floor, step after careful step, and the direction of everything was correct. And she was paying attention. She had never stopped.